luscious texture of a chocolate bar melting in your mouth is the type of luxury we take for granted in our modern day and age. An estimated 7.5 million tons of chocolate is consumed every year, creating an industry that's valued at around $128 billion as of 2024. But have you ever wondered how this delectable delight is made? Join us as we explore the journey from cocoa beans to the sweet treat we all love. It all starts with cacao beans. Don't let the name fool you though. These so-called beans are actually the seeds of a tropical fruit. The Theobroma cacao tree is native to South America, and its seeds were so highly sought after that the Aztecs used them as a form of currency. The tree grows all around the world nowadays, and farmers can tell that the fruit is ready for harvest when the color changes. Now, you might think that they use a massive machine to cut down all those pods, but that's just not possible. You see, the cacao tree is extremely fragile, so they need to detach each pod by hand to ensure their survival. Interestingly enough, modern cocoa harvesting methods are basically unchanged since the time of the ancient Mayan civilization thousands of years ago. Each pod contains dozens of cacao beans, but if you take a look at them, you might not even realize what they are. The pulpy white fruit looks nothing like chocolate. So how exactly does it take its final form? Well, the humble cocoa pod is only beginning its journey. The next step is to ferment the freshly harvested beans. The white flesh might look unappetizing at first, but it has a pretty decent smell. Farmers describe it as similar to lychee, another fruit that has tender white flesh surrounding a hard brown seed. That's where the similarities end, however, since the cocoa bean undergoes a dramatic transformation over the next few days. Each bean is gently separated from the flesh and scooped out into a pile. There's still a bit of meat on them, and the sugars contained within will help with the fermentation process. Farmers pack these beans into specially designed fermentation containers where they're left for around a week. They let off a ton of heat during this time, with temperatures in the boxes often reaching as high as 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That helps the flavor to develop and kill any harmful bacteria, leaving the beans ready for step 3. After fermentation, the beans are left to dry. They've gotten pretty brown by this point, but they still contain a lot of moisture. As a result, farmers lay the beans out under the sun for several days, allowing them to dry until just 7% of moisture content remains. This isn't always possible though. Cocoa farmers in wetter parts of the world often use fire to get the job done, which happens to impart a unique smoky flavor to the beans. This process is essential for making sure that they reach the buyer in good condition by eliminating the possibility of mold during their months-long journey. Once the beans are dry, the farmer's job is over. It's time to bag these bad boys up and send them off to a chocolate maker. This is where things start to get really magical. Chocolate companies kick things off by roasting the beans. However, before they can do that, they need to sift out the debris. It's a labor-intensive process because of how many little twigs and rocks can come along for the ride, not to mention the odd moldy bean that hadn't fully dried. Sometimes they even find bits of metal hiding in the bean sack. Eventually, the cleaned-out beans are set aside for roasting, but it's not as simple as you'd expect. Roasting duration and temperature can strongly influence the final product, with darker roasts creating more complex flavors than lighter ones. Generally speaking, chocolate manufacturers roast them for around an hour, although they might switch things up based on factors like size and what type of bean they're working with. Some manufacturers don't even roast their beans, preferring to use unroasted dried beans instead. This preserves both the original flavor as well as some of the vitamins and minerals lost in the heat of the oven. That said, roasting is usually the way to go. It increases the chocolate's shelf life and provides a more familiar flavor. As a bonus, it cracks open the shell surrounding the bean. That comes in handy for the next step. Winnowing. The beans consist of two basic components, the outer shell and the essential cocoa nibs contained within. An hour in the oven will do a lot to loosen the shells up, but they need to be removed entirely since they don't have much of a flavor and might still have some lingering microbes. Now, because the shells are split apart while roasting, chocolate manufacturers can just dump the whole batch into something called a winnowing machine. The outer layer is quite thin, so all this device needs to do is blow jets of air onto the beans to remove the husks. As for the empty shells, they can be pretty useful too. Some companies use them to make cacao tea, and they also make great fertilizer. But either way, they need to separate the precious nibs inside so that they're ready for further processing. The nibs are then ground up in a special machine. This is one of the most critical junctures of the entire process, since it turns the cocoa nibs into a more chocolatey form that we'd recognize. It requires the use of a mélanger grinder, which basically consists of 2 stone slabs that turn the nibs into a thick paste. Some call it cocoa mass, others cocoa liquor due to its surprisingly boozy aroma. But one thing's for sure, it doesn't taste great. Most would describe it as unpleasantly acid and far too bitter. But as the grinding continues, the paste begins to separate into cocoa butter and cocoa solids. Quite a few manufacturers preheat their beans to speed up the separation. That's because releasing more cocoa butter gives the chocolate a creamier mouthfeel, which is why some companies grind their nibs for days before they're satisfied. If you want to get really technical, you might place the cocoa mass into a refiner. This reduces the size of the cocoa particles, giving complete control over their size. The chocolate acquires an even consistency after refining, but there's even more complexity involved when high-end chocolatiers get involved. They like to do something called conching, which is when they gradually incorporate air into the paste to dry it up some more and remove any remaining bitterness. Whether they opt for a basic grind or they go the extra mile with conching, chocolate manufacturers generally add the good stuff during this stage. That includes sugar and milk powder for your basic milk chocolate, and sometimes flavorings like vanilla are tossed into the mix as well. By this point, the cocoa mass has basically turned into delicious chocolate. You could eat a big old dollop straight out of the machine if you wanted to, but after some time, the texture would get crumbly and unappetizing. That's why the vast majority of chocolate companies finish things off with tempering. A few of the fancier chocolate companies prefer to let their chocolate age for months before this step. But no matter what, tempering is where the long journey ends. Untempered chocolate will usually see some fat separation before too long, so this final step ensures that the chocolate will be at peak quality until someone buys it. On top of that, the tempering process gives candy bars their famous snap, shine, and texture. So how does this work? Well, it's an especially tricky part of the process. It involves heating the chocolate, cooling it back down, and then reheating it ever so slightly. Many say it can be done by hand, particularly high-end chocolatiers, but large-scale manufacturers have developed tempering machines to automate the process. A lot can go wrong along the way, but as long as it's done by experts, tempering will alter the molecular structure of the chocolate so that the chocolate is firm at room temperature but instantly melts when you put it in your mouth. And voila! You now have chocolate that will satisfy midnight cravings around the world. All that's left is to mold it into the desired shape, leave it to cool, and then pack it up for sale. Chocolate is usually wrapped in foil or plastic to maintain freshness, allowing stores to stock up without worrying about them spoiling. So, which one of these chocolate-making steps interested you the most? Let us know in the comments. But that's all for today. See ya!